Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time, from international relations and global economics to philosophy and science. No topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Today, we are very pleased indeed to have on our show Vlad Vexler to talk about the recent confused goings-on in Russia. Vlad was born in Soviet Russia but now lives in Britain. He is a philosopher and well-known YouTube commentator on Russian politics. I've been watching Vlad's YouTube posts with great interest over the past year and have been struck by his analysis and his unique presentation style. We'll be posting Vlad's YouTube channel link on our show notes, so if you're not familiar with Vlad's work, please take a look at his YouTube channel. You won't be disappointed. Vlad, thank you for joining us on The Focus.
Pleasure to be with you.
Vlad, what are your views on how the Western media and commentariat have been covering the Prigozhin Mutiny?
It's been hard to cover it because even experts have had to abstain from saying they've had a clear understanding of what's going on. Yeah. So we don't want to be too critical. Having said that, inevitably, with the extraordinary story of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, there is an outrage that Western citizens feel about what's going on. There is a fascination that Western citizens feel about what's going on. And that can have several effects. One of them is a kind of gamification of war, as I call it, looking at the story as it's developing and trying to solve it as though it were a puzzle long before there is sufficient evidence to do this. We saw quite a bit of that during Prigozhin's mutiny, not just with large-scale social media accounts tweeting unverified and inconclusive bits of information, but sometimes, unfortunately, also mainstream journalists retweeting this and going along with it. But I think how harshly you condemn this or just shrug your shoulders at it is a matter of sensibility, right? I mean, a world without this sort of stuff might just be a world without human beings. So we don't want to ask too much of ourselves. On the other hand, if you're in a very specific role, like you are an expert or you are a journalist for a major institution, you do obviously have responsibilities to be slow and give your audience also the necessary skills, which are in short supply at the moment, to negotiate this extremely complex informational environment that we're living in.
Vlad, I'm reminded of a conversation that I had earlier today with a friend of mine, and we were talking about pareidolia, you know, that human need or instinct to see patterns in things. So we can look at the face on Mars and say, there's a face on Mars and aliens built it, because we are looking for a pattern. And if we see it, it recognizes, you know, it's something that we recognize deep within us. But as a political analyst, we are very much guilty of doing the same thing in terms of looking at, dare I say, opaque political structures. We get these little nuggets and we think that we know a truth by trying to attach significance to small events and rapidly moving events. So perhaps we're kind of like guilty of that, yeah?
Saying I don't know is a very beautiful and important human skill, I think.
I think so too. Absolutely. Well, speaking of which, just before we hit the record button, I made mention that there was an Al Jazeera report that seems to have confirmed from the Moscow Times that General Sergei Surovikin has been arrested for choosing Prigozhin's side, with some military bloggers suggesting that a large-scale purge of the Russian military is underway. Now, this, as you rightly point out, has not been confirmed, and it's not been confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry. Mind you, I don't know whether or not they'd ever confirm something like this. But if it is true, how significant would this development be?
It would be very significant because it would mean that Putin is reconceptualizing even more what happened from a revolt to a revolution.
Yeah.
Putin's language has actually been as though what was developing was a revolution. That's how Putin immediately, well, that was how Putin first reacted to it about 13 hours after it happened. So he's already gone there, but then that was backtracked upon by the entire propaganda machine that has tried to normalize what happened. And if you're going to go around arresting people who are near the very top of your military command, that means you're saying that something closer to a revolutionary act was taking place. So if that story were to get confirmed, and I'm still skeptical of it, it would mean a fundamental admission from the Kremlin that they were on the verge of something that was deeper than just a mutiny.
Amazing. So as far as we know, Minister for Defense Sergei Shoigu and Army Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov seem to be firmly in their positions. So from a political perspective, Prigozhin's putsch failed to achieve his key aim of getting rid of at least Shoigu, a man with whom Prigozhin has had a very difficult relationship. Can you give our audience your take on what caused this falling out?
Well, I think what the audience would benefit from hearing from me, at least, is what allowed this conflict to perpetuate. Some of the issues in it have been visible, and you've heard Prigozhin complaining about being deprioritized in various ways by the Ministry of Defense. But what we have to understand is that historically, the way Putin has run his show is by outsourcing some of his power to his court, which is a murky court, a court without clear positions for everybody in it, a court with a rough sense of the relative importance of every person in it, but not always much more than that. Then that court has gone about doing various things, has gone about engaging in conflict with itself, and then Putin would appear to referee that conflict. And that sat very well with the nature of Putin's perceived legitimacy, which is as a figure who himself can't be questioned as long as there is the perception of enough public support, and who comes in from above, as it were, and intervenes in the political muck only when necessary, and does so in a convincing way. Putin's problem has been that he then transposed this way of operating onto a much more intensified context, the context of the war. And the functionality of Prigozhin here worked similarly to the functionality of conflicting parties at peacetime. Prigozhin was attacking the Ministry of Defense. That was serving Putin's interests because he needed the flak of the war going badly to be deflected from him onto, above all, Shoigu. There may have been even other purposes for Putin of Prigozhin's interventions, one being just that need to absorb and then control resentment at the incompetence of the government and at the confused policies of the government. And that's been something the Putin regime has practiced for a very long time. And these are functions that Prigozhin was serving, but this got completely out of control. And what used to work in peacetime has ceased to work in wartime, and Putin didn't react in time when what is normally a functional pattern of conflict that he is happy to perpetuate started spinning out of control. Partly, I think, through the intensity of war and perhaps a lack of access to Putin himself, taking Prigozhin into a place others thought he would never get to because of his extraordinary history of service and loyalty to the regime.
It's interesting. I'm reminded of World War II and the games that Stalin himself were playing among his inner circle, favoring some over others in order to deflect when things weren't going particularly well. Do you think that, and again, do you think that there's like I hate using this because it kind of pegs a country's political culture, but so far as Russia has evolved from the Soviet Union, do you think that Putin is playing to a distinct dictatorial element within the Russian political context? Playing,
I want you to
being,
say a bit more about that.
all right, I say, acting as the king who sits on top of, as you say, the murky court, that no one really has any defined roles. People can be shoveled around, or shoved around, I should say, and he has the final word to favor or disfavor whoever happens to be close to him, depending on circumstance. This seems a particularly Soviet style of doing politics.
There are two separate issues here. One is unpredictability, and the other is bureaucratic procedure. Certainly since Stalin, the Soviet regimes have had far more bureaucratic procedure than the Putin regime. They have been far more procedurally adequate, and the roles of the different people in the process were both more clearly visible and more consistently adhered to. So in that sense, there is a difference. Where there is a similarity is in the unpredictability of the fates of people, who can get dangerously close to power and then need to be shifted, need to be removed, need to be dealt with. So I think that sense of unpredictability is there, but I wouldn't compare this regime in many respects to the Soviet project. If there is an historical comparison, I'm not saying it's a good one, this is much closer to Nazi Germany than it is to the Soviet Union. It's not ideologically close to the Soviet Union. It's not procedurally close to the Soviet Union. It's also got various aspects of mysticism and transcendence to it that we didn't associate with the scientistic worldview of the Soviet Union. So of course there are going to be some similarities, but I think there are also some interesting ways in which the Soviet Union is very much unlike what the Putin regime is. Putin himself, of course, having said that the collapse of the Soviet Union is the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, isn't much of a fan of the Soviet order. What he is a fan of is telling a long-distance story that, with a lot of made-up history, connects Tsardom with the Soviet period in a way that tells us, well, look, this was all the great Russian Empire. Some of these bits of history need to be worked up, and that's why Putin tries to historically disappear Lenin. For Putin, Lenin is a kind of historical aberration and a no-good character who cultivated a revolution, and so Putin has to use very special devices to downgrade Lenin's place. But that's because he is trying to create a continuity between pre-1917 and post-1917 Russia. But this is obviously a fascinating and big conversation.
Oh, it is. And I think it's a really important one to have as well, because look, there are a lot of people out there that have been making a lot of false historic analogies. And I think that by being able to clarify the difference between Putin on the one side, Stalin on the other, will help, hopefully, some of the audience and some other observers out there not to conflate the two, because there are these differences. And I don't think that that's really well understood by
Let me tell you one very, very big difference between Stalin and Putin. Stalin was completely intolerant of the idea of diluting the state's monopoly over organized violence. Whereas diluting that monopoly has been a series of choices that Putin has made That's actually partly what ended in this situation we've witnessed over the last few days. That's a very, very big difference between Putin and Stalin. This is not a Stalinist move to start multiplying quasi state-controlled military organizations. Stalin would have been absolutely allergic to this.
Okay, now bringing it back to the current days. So Prigozhin has become extremely wealthy on the back of his ties to private military company, the Wagner Group. But in a recent Newsweek story, Wagner is said to be handing over its heavy military equipment to the Russian army on a July 1st deadline. Do you think Wagner will make this deadline? It's just around the corner. And do you think this is the end of Wagner as we understand it?
I think we need to, first of all, see what happens with Wagner outside of Russia. And I think probably some defense analysts are going to be in a better place to comment on this than I am. What we can say is that this is effectively the end of Wagner as part of Russia's fighting force in Ukraine. I think that is what we can put on the table. I think it's too early to say what is going to happen with Wagner's global role. And it might be too early to say exactly in what capacity Wagner is going to be present in Belarus. We just need to watch and see.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned Belarus. Is Prigozhin's exile to Belarus with Wagner troops a problem or an opportunity for Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko? Lukashenko has a long, peculiar history with regarding his ties to Russia. Prior to the war in Ukraine, he was a freewheeling dictator doing deals with the West and Russia. Now he's firmly under Putin's control. Is Lukashenko a willing puppet of Vladimir Putin, or can he use Prigozhin's exile in his country as leverage to put distance between himself and the Russian leader?
Lukashenko is a very skillful politician. He is a very toxic and unlovely character, probably with significant narcissism challenges, but is also patient, hard-nosed, and capable of implementing a strategy that he's patient with. So even if he is your puppet, there's always the risk that puppet will exploit you. Yeah. Now, since the extraordinary protests in 2020 in Belarus, Lukashenko's position has been one of dependence on the Kremlin, deep dependence on the Kremlin. To some extent, he is going to enjoy this role of intermediary that he has supposedly played over the last few days. Probably he is overstating that role, but nevertheless, he's very happy about it because anything that gives him extra leverage in his relationship with the Kremlin, he would like. Now, from a non-Lukashenko point of view, if I'm just a Belarusian citizen, I'm not impressed with this at all. I'm already terribly unimpressed by this dictator running my country, who is in turn run by another dictator. But what worries me aren't just issues of security for neighboring countries, but the scenario of further democratic fervent in Belarus, leading to a situation where Lukashenko may use Wagner as a tool for keeping power in a circumstance in which he, without Wagner, might have lost it. That's one of my fears if I'm a Belarusian citizen who wants democracy for my country. And it's very important to say that Belarus does not have the deep level of depoliticization that Russia has. Yeah. So Belarus is culturally, in terms of political culture, closer to, if you like, the destination of, attunement to basic democratic institutions and procedures. So to a greater extent than Russia, we can serve Belarus, that it's being kept hostage by its regime. Having said all of this, if I'm Lukashenko, I'm absolutely worried about all kinds of ways in which this can get out of control. But what we need to watch for here is the stability of the Putin regime, the stability of the Lukashenko regime, and what degree of sovereignty Lukashenko has in anything that happens on Belarusian territory. With regard to many questions of sovereignty, we're not clear what's going on. We're not even clear about what's going on with the nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory.
We will mention that later. Yeah, but you're right. You're absolutely right. One thing that I was going to say, Vlad, is that, you know, I can't recall the exact amount, but I think somewhere in the vicinity of about 50,000 Russian soldiers are in Belarus. And then you're going to have an undisclosed number of Wagner forces in Belarus. And you've got Lukashenko playing, as you rightly point out, a game where he could possibly use Wagner forces to crack down on rebellious Belarusians. It seems that Wagner may become a power base for Lukashenko, and he can stand aside from the hand of Moscow and the Russian soldiers who are in Belarus to a degree. Gives him some sort of sovereignty, even though we think that his sovereignty has been completely taken away by Putin. But there is that leverage there, don't you think?
That comes in if the Putin regime destabilizes more. I think at the moment, Belarus is roughly under Russia's control, but this might be no longer true 3 months from now. So that's the extraordinary, tragic dependence that Belarusian folks have on this extraordinary collapsing empire next door to them. They can't navigate their fate until the Putin regime itself weakens, which is a tragic situation.
No, it certainly is. So just staying on Wagner for the moment, Wagner was Russia's premier dirty tricks outfit, neither legally recognized by the Russian state or given any official role. Its power was really in giving plausible deniability for the defense or prosecution of Russian national interests abroad. Putin has recently announced that Wagner was dependent on Russian state finances. This means that Russia owned Wagner. But if Russia owns Wagner, must it therefore also retrospectively own all of the atrocities committed by Wagner in helping pursue Russian interests? And is this not also a legal conundrum for Putin?
I think that legal conundrums are secondary in this situation where Putin is trying to keep power. And now he has started deploying a strategy not of going after Prigozhin for organizing the revolutionary situation he organized, but he started going after Prigozhin for his finances and corruption. And Putin's aim there is to demythologize Prigozhin, to say he's just like us. He's trying to contrast himself to us, but he is just like us. Do not believe these impressions that have come from some of the Z radical circles, that Prigozhin is a new kind of spiritual leader for Russia. Putin is trying to deflate that, and that's a decision that certainly on his terms makes sense. If the question is ethical, the answer is absolutely Russia is responsible for everything Wagner has done. If the question is political, the answer, of course, has to be complex, because various hybrid means of war work. And in a certain way, Ukraine is itself a demonstration of this, because Western citizens in part failed to wake up to what happened in 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine in a much less direct way, because it wasn't clear who was doing what, whether this was a real war or whether it wasn't. And it's very difficult for Western powers to act unless they have sufficient democratic will. And democratic will is not easily formed on the basis of looking at hybrid military enterprises. So at a political level, this stuff works, but it's just backfired very badly for Putin in the context of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Mm. Vlad, you've been extremely critical of Putin and his politics. Every Russian enterprise, it seems, is rotten to its core, whether we talk about high-end businesses or state-run enterprises or politics. The Russian elite is happy to take their cut and exploit the fact that much of Russia will remain cowed from saying anything publicly for fear of Putin and his security thugs. But Prigozhin had the strength to confront the big man in the Kremlin. I suppose the moral of the story is that it takes a bully to fight a bully, and Prigozhin has a reputation for ruthlessness, so perhaps he was the perfect foil for Putin. I mean, I know this is pure speculation, but if you'll indulge me, do you think Prigozhin's march on Moscow failed because he just didn't have the numbers necessary in the Kremlin to achieve his publicly stated goal of removing Shoigu?
I think that Prigozhin wasn't himself clear on what he was doing.
Yes.
And I think that the question of whether this was just a mutiny to make demands of Putin to make the war more effective, or whether this was a revolutionary enterprise, well, between these two, I don't think we can settle without introducing quite a bit of gray. I think one reason that certainly played a role in this mutiny not going further is that Prigozhin was not deeply ideologically motivated.
Correct.
This was somebody who was after his slice of cake, roughly speaking. But he went after his slice of cake in such a way that he created a situation that the entire cake could have fallen off the table, if not into his hands, then into somebody else's hands. That was a risk. And I do think that the situation that Prigozhin cultivated had a revolutionary flavor. And I think that's exactly how Putin reacted to it. And I personally haven't seen Putin as rocked as he has been in the last few days. Putin has not reacted to this as though it were a mutiny emotionally. Putin's emotional, almost physiological reaction to this is as though his life was in existential danger. So that's interesting. But that doesn't mean that Prigozhin's conscious aspiration was to remove Putin. I don't think it was. But Prigozhin ended up in a situation where if this were to go further, the consequences would not have been entirely predictable. So one element here is a lack of ideological commitment on Prigozhin's part. A second element is that there was no evidence of the army going over to Prigozhin's side in significant numbers. Had this been different, they may have gone further. So I probably see the situation as being a story in which Prigozhin was as much an actor as an author. He may have even felt that things had got out of control in a way he didn't anticipate. So it's also, of course, possible that the extraordinary intensity and, if you like, insanity of war somehow got to him and made him capable of actions he wouldn't have necessarily taken if he sat in a cool room for a month and thought about them. So this is a very messy thing to unravel, and that's why I'm uncomfortable to say whether this was a clearly a coup, or whether this was clearly a mutiny and nothing more. I mean, if Prigozhin had, of course, in some kind of fantastical way, succeeded in disappearing Shoigu and Gerasimov, that would have been an existential threat to Putin's power. So these lines are very hard to draw. Why it didn't succeed requires from us an understanding of what it was that Prigozhin was trying to do. I think even he doesn't have an answer to that. But I think that a couple of elements that are interesting is the army not going over to Prigozhin, and Prigozhin having in the end a mercantilist, pragmatic outlook rather than a zealous, Z-radical ideological outlook that may have propelled somebody else to say to that 4,000 or 5,000 people marching toward Moscow and to Utkin, the captain of these folks, you have to go on, you have to go on. So this is something that we're going to have to clarify over time, how we see this. But at the moment, I'm not comfortable to say something entirely clear.
No, look, and that's quite right. The thing that I got, and I took some notes earlier, and my observation was there was an element, and I mean, I hate to say it because we're talking about people in politics that you really don't want to have in politics, because, I put my hand up and say I'm a staunch defender of democracy. But there was this sort of, dare I say, broken bromance between Prigozhin and Putin. And you could tell by the way that they avoided talking about each other, whether it was Prigozhin on Telegram or whether it was Putin's announcement on the state television. There was almost that sort of palpable sense of heartbreak on both sides. If only Vladimir Putin would understand what I'm trying to say. Maybe I can, convince him that Shoigu is a bad guy and he'll get removed. But I've got no pretenses for the throne itself. I'll leave Vladimir as he is. No revolution ever goes well when it's not well thought out. It has to be decisively organized. One of the things that I put down also is the fact that, why go after Shoigu? I mean, if he's truly ideological or if he's truly politically ambitious for the top job, why go after Shoigu when he can go after Putin? It certainly clarifies things. It also puts into the public mindset that there is now a challenger for the top job, and so he can then mobilize the public any which way he wants to achieve his end. But I keep on coming back to the fact that I truly think, and I absolutely support you on what you were saying, but I think that there's also that personal element. They've been friends and collaborators for years, and having broken apart in this strange, gray, not really certain what the end point was going to be, but they broke the trust between the two of them. I don't know. It just seems a bit personal. It was a personal thing. It wasn't just a political fight between two politically motivated people.
I think that at that level of power, there is an inevitability to the personal coming second when we're talking about maintaining power over a big country, maintaining power over an empire. Historically, I would say Prigozhin's relationship with Putin is more of a client and service provider relationship, where Prigozhin was always wanting his informal power to remain stable and eventually maybe get a bit more formal recognition. In some ways, that may have been where Prigozhin himself was going in some of his thinking a few months ago. He wanted to sit down at the table and not just be somebody who is invited into the room. Putin's reaction to the mutiny was, I think, visceral, and it did express Putin's allergy to any sense of political betrayal, which is the highest moral crime for Putin. And so as soon as this happened, Putin irreversibly wrote off Prigozhin in every way except those which I suppose he might not be able to follow through with because it wouldn't be pragmatic for him. So it might be that he doesn't end up physically eliminating Prigozhin, but that extraordinary sense of political betrayal was so palpable in Putin. It's his most significant ethical allergy.
Yeah.
And it's also his biggest fear politically, that image of being a Gaddafi, that image of being a victim of some kind of coup or revolution is his worst nightmare. So his feelings about Prigozhin, I don't think are about loss of friendship as much as they are about an absolutely all-consuming sense of rage at an unforgivable betrayal that has to remain irreversibly unforgivable. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a documentary quite some years ago where when Putin was asked what what is the thing that he can never forgive, and he said quite bluntly, betrayal. So I think that you're absolutely right. That's in his DNA. That really is. Okay, I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from the UK, we're speaking with philosopher and analyst of Russian politics, Vlad Vexler. So, Vlad, Russia doesn't have a very strong or organized political opposition and no codified civil liberties. And yet there is Alexei Navalny, the imprisoned Russian opposition leader. Has any of the recent internal tumult had an effect on how Russians view Navalny as a potential replacement for Putin? And if not, do you think that this might change in time as the current system eats itself in a spasm of paranoia?
I think it could change in time. And I think partly Navalny is alive because Putin is aware that a time may come where he needs him. Putin wouldn't like that time to come, but Putin is aware that that's possible, right, and that Navalny could be somebody he could negotiate with. Now, that's not the only reason. Other reasons, such as the fact that keeping him in jail and trying to break him is psychologically is politically more effective than just killing him at the moment. That calculus could change at any point, which is why Navalny is in a very precarious situation, even if his health in prison holds. What Russians think about Navalny, and especially what they think about Navalny in the light of the events of the last few days, is hard to capture because a radically depoliticized population does not have a political opinion. So it requires further politicization for more than just a small percentage of the Russian population, more than just 10, 15, 20% of the Russian population, to take any view at all on Navalny, as opposed to being in a position where they outsource politics to the Kremlin, hope the Kremlin makes decisions that aren't catastrophic, and hope that everything endures and they can keep on getting on with their lives. That eventually may wobble. But until it does, it's not possible to look at the Russian population and say, well, yes, 45% of them are sympathetic to Navalny and the rest aren't. What the group that you can definitely say something about are those who are not depoliticized, but just silenced by repression. That is, at a push, it could be 20 million Russians. So it's not a small number of people. And these people would be sympathetic to a figure like Navalny. Don't forget, when we are dealing with an extremely unstable, tyrannical society, we're not talking about favoring politicians because you would enjoy voting for them under relatively idealistic conditions of a stable Western democracy. So when we're asking Russians, do you like Navalny? It can't really be the same question as he has 17 policy positions. How do you feel about them? It's more a question of, is this somebody who could destabilize the Putin regime? Is this somebody who could convincingly give people the idea that there is an alternative to Putin? Is this somebody who can politicize more than just the liberal, democratic, pro-Western demographic? These are the questions. And I think sometimes when absolutely understandably outraged Ukrainians discuss Navalny, or when we in the West discuss Navalny, we tend to somehow begin these conversations as though somebody was inviting somebody to vote for him. But nobody's voting for Navalny. He is just a potentially a useful political tool for people in that region to achieve their aims. It's potentially a useful tool for Ukraine because somebody who could politicize the Russian space. It's a useful tool for anti-Putin Russians because Navalny does have a good potential for political capital, I would say.
Hmm. Although it is unlikely that the condottieri Prigozhin was in the pay of a foreign government, now that he's made his play, does this all change? Do you think he's now open for business in Minsk and ready to accept foreign money for political favors? That is, to continue to destabilize and possibly dethrone Putin? Or is he a true Russian patriot through and through?
I don't think he is either ready to dethrone Putin or a true Russian patriot. I think that he is somebody with a criminal psychology and a mercantilist psychology who is not heavily ideological. This war that he was fighting was not his war. He was fighting this war because that's how circumstances panned out. He doesn't in a special way disbelieve in the war, but he doesn't believe in it either. So I think that's Prigozhin. And he is obviously not going to be welcome in most parts of the world, but wherever he is allowed to permeate with Wagner, if he is, he will continue his presence there and he will continue his work so long as that's possible. Exactly what is going to be possible for Prigozhin, we're going to have to see. He might not be alive a month from now. But hypothetically, is he going to want to carry on some of the activities that he used to engage in rather than becoming an ideological revolutionary? I think the answer to that is yes. But we need to see what happens with him. We need to see what he is allowed to keep on doing.
Some have bought into the idea that the events of last weekend were all a ruse, that Putin and Prigozhin are still co-conspirators and that they have used the whole march on Moscow as a deception operation designed to keep Ukraine and the West off guard. I mean, to me, this sounds all extremely far-fetched. But how would you answer this?
I think that there are different patterns here. Obviously, I can't think of a single Russia expert who would entertain that possibility. So that's a possibility that recedes as you approximate to greater contextual knowledge. I think that one way to understand why that view was prevalent and would be prevalent in equivalent future circumstances is that people are engaged in different kinds of activities online. There are people who are academic experts. There are people who are journalists. There are people who are info warriors, pro-Ukraine info warriors. They're outraged by the war, and whether it's effective or not is an entirely separate question, but they think that engaging with any informational event in a way that might serve Ukrainian interest is the right thing to do. There are plenty of entrepreneurs who are growing online profiles on the back of their story, and a lot of them are pro-Ukrainian. And I would even go as far as saying that that's not necessarily bad, because often when there is a good cause, not all the people lining up behind it will line up for the same reason and with the most transparently lovely intent. So partly I welcome some of the entrepreneurship, but it really does have its dangers too. And the dangers are not far from what we mentioned earlier, which is the gamification of war for the benefit of self-advancement in relation to one's audience and in relation to whatever algorithms one is dealing with. Certainly, as somebody who communicates on YouTube, I can tell you that my views would double if I started saying that various kinds of actions happening on Russian territory are all false flag operations controlled by the Kremlin. People genuinely want to hear that, and it's an attractive thing to hear, and it's a thing that in a neat package rounds off a complex political situation that might otherwise not make as much sense or not be as appetizing to consume. So, you know, a lot of people watching this are watching it as though it were half real, as though they're watching a soap. And saying that Mr. Putin and Mr. Prigozhin have conspired together is a more successful episode, I think, and a more enjoyable episode than saying that this is a case of an aspiring empire that is little by little disintegrating, little by little losing control over its borders, little by little losing monopoly over organized violence. That's happening incrementally and not all in one go. That is less attractive than these two guys got together and created a bit of theater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. All right. So last question. Throughout the war, you've commented on Putin's potential to use nuclear weapons. He certainly has threatened their use. He's even deployed some tactical nuclear weapons to neighboring Belarus. But for actual use, this seems to be a very unlikely option in spite of the demise of Wagner, Russia's better quality fighters, the muddling to poor performance of the Russian army conscripts in Ukraine, and now the slight opening of Russian high politics to potentially challenge the Russian leader. So with so much going wrong with the war on Ukraine destabilizing Mother Russia, what utility, if any, has Putin's nuclear deterrence? Has it provided Putin with nothing more than a chance for grandstanding and chest beating, or is there something more to it that we in the West fail to see or even to acknowledge?
So I think that Putin's nuclear blackmail has worked. I think that part of the reason that Ukraine may retake all of its territories up to 1991, but why it would be unreasonable to regard that today as necessarily a likely outcome is because of nuclear blackmail. And the dosing of weapons supplies to Ukraine is clearly partly, there are other factors involved, as you would know better than I, but it's partly a product of escalation management. And that is why, with so many of these additional steps that the West has made, it's always been about just getting your little toe through the door, seeing if nothing happens, then you put in a second toe and a third, and on we go. And Ukrainians have been enormously frustrated by that, but partly that is a reflection, even though I'm myself critical of some of the slowness of this, that is partly a reflection of how responsible Western leaders have been about protecting the security of their citizens from nuclear war, which is, of course, a very important global threat. As I am not able to give any military analysis, as I'm not able to say anything interesting about the Russian chain of command when it comes to using either non-strategic or strategic nuclear weapons, I can say a couple of things, one being psychological and one being political. I think politically it's reasonable to assume that a very weak Putin may have a reduced chance of an instruction to use nuclear weapons going through the chain of command successfully. That hopefully works in our favor. And that's a political observation, that by the time Putin may want to use a non-strategic nuclear weapon, he may not have the power to do it. The psychological point I would make is, however, a little bit disconcerting, which is why making it, it's also important to not exaggerate it. And that is that there is indeed this very big contrast between Putin and all the Soviet leaders in a kind of mysticism and fundamentalism with which he comes to looking at the world, at Russian culture's place in the world, and his own personal significance for Russian culture. He does, ironically, have a somewhat Wagnerian view of himself. So that's where the real Wagner is, because Putin, to some extent, is indulged in the idea that the will of a single individual is somehow here connected to the destiny of an entire people. That's a very disturbing and unhealthy thought for politics, but unfortunately we're dealing with somebody who has it there. And what I think that means is that there is a disturbing mystical element that is sincere and genuinely present behind Putin's statements, like, what's the point for the world to exist if there isn't Russia in it? And how I read that in practical terms is that it's an echo of what we typically encounter with fundamentalist terrorism, which often comes with a magical distinction between before and after. The idea being that you could create a bloodbath today, but somehow use that bloodbath to bring about a saintly, peaceful order that ensues after, and is in no way contaminated by the bloodbath that had to be done to trigger that new saintly and peaceful order. That is widely discussed in literature on the psychology of fundamentalist violence, and I detect an echo of that in Putin's thinking. The way I translate it into practice is by saying that, of course, Putin does not want World War III, and he would go out of his way to avoid a scenario where the world slips into a strategic nuclear exchange. But his aversion to it is not as deep as ours, and it's not as deep as Brezhnev's or Khrushchev's. There's a fundamental difference in psychology there. Now, we're only speaking about one person, which is good, because there are other people who would have to be involved in this process. But the downside is that Putin is surrounded at the moment by about a handful of people who think similarly. And that's a worry. And what we have to watch for is any indication of whether they're talking about this, whether they're talking about this in jest, how often this comes up as a topic. There has been an outbreak recently in the Russian sort of strategic commentariat community of articles on first use of nuclear weapons. And one of the interesting questions for us is, where are these conversations coming from? Are these pieces outsourced by the Kremlin in order to intimidate us? Or are these pieces partly written to ingratiate the authors with the Kremlin, because they realize that some of these conversations are happening in the Kremlin too? So what I want to say about this uncomfortable, mystical and fundamentalist quality to these folks in the Kremlin is that it does not radically change. It does not radically change how we think about nuclear risk. But do I think that myself and some other commentators who are pointing this out have a point here, that it changes it to some extent and should make us more cautious? Yes, I do. That's an unlovely reality. And to that extent, we're not dealing with nuclear agents that are as responsible as, for example, Khrushchev was.
Vlad, it was a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much for your time and for joining us today and for sharing your insights on the focus.
My pleasure.
And to our audience, thanks for tuning into the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter, or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. And please leave us your comments on inquiries@sageinternational.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and/or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.